Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Books and Mortar podcast with me, your host, Razia, where we talk about the books that build us. This episode is about a really awesome book called We Solve Murders by Richard Osman. So this is the second of Richard Osman's collection. The first series that he wrote is the Thursday Murder Club, and that was the title of the first book, and it was followed by another 3 books, and I understand that book 5 will be released this year in 2025. The first book has actually been adapted for film, and it will be releasing on Netflix sometimes this year as well, so I'm actually quite excited about that. And in spite of him actually having published so many books, well done, Mr. Osman, this is the only the second book of his that I have read. The thing about Richard Osman is that he writes incredibly likable characters. So We Solve Murders follows Amy, the bodyguard, and her retired policeman father-in-law, Steve, as they work to solve several murders that could potentially put Amy behind bars or actually get her killed. So let me read you the synopsis at the back of the book. Steve Wheeler is enjoying retired life. He does the odd bit of investigation work, but he prefers his familiar habits and routines. The pub quiz, his favorite bench, the cat waiting for him when he comes home. His days of adventures are over. Adrenaline is daughter-in-law Amy's business now. Amy Wheeler thinks adrenaline is good for the soul. As a private security officer, she doesn't stay still long enough for habits or routines. She's currently on a remote island, keeping world-famous author Rosie D'Antonio alive, which was meant to be an easy job. Then a dead body, a bag of money, and a killer with their sights on Amy have her sending an SOS to the only person she trusts. A breakneck race around the world begins, but can Amy and Steve stay one step ahead of a deadly enemy? So the synopsis actually very neatly summarizes part 1 of the book, almost in its entirety. Actually, there are 3 parts to this book. And that's actually quite nice because it kind of makes it easier to review it as well. So as it says, Amy is a private bodyguard, and she's guarding millionaire author Rosie D'Antonio on a private island in the US because she wrote, none too subtly, about a Russian chemical manufacturer or something like that in one of her books. And he was not very flattered by her description of him. So the guy, he obviously realized that she based the character on him, and he's been sending her death threats. So that's why Amy is there. Amy works for a security company called Maximum Impact Security, and they are known for guarding the rich and famous. I love Rosie. She is such an incredible character because she's so full of character, and Amy says that she could be anywhere between the ages of 60 and 80. She can't actually tell. So Steve, Amy's father-in-law, lives in a little village that he and his wife retired to when his days of policing came to an end. He joined the police force when he was 18 years old, and from that day, he basically saw the worst of what London had to offer, and obviously it made him a smidge cynical and paranoid, and he was determined to fix the dark underbelly of his little village. But there wasn't one. So it's it reminds me of an episode actually of the Gilmore Girls when Paris goes to Stars Hollow and she meets Rory there, and she is determined to expose the dark underbelly of Stars Hollow. And then Rory's like, yeah, but there isn't one. So Steve finally manages to relax in his new home, and he allows himself to become part of his little community, which was just as well because I think that he needed them even more after his wife passed away. So thank goodness for Amy, who calls him every day. Amy's had a rough childhood, and Steve is coping with his grief. And both of them know that they don't actually need to talk to anyone about their issues because, they don't even have issues. So they talk about nothing. Steve talks to his wife, though, every day. Into a dictaphone for some reason, but he talks to her every day. I think a lot of people do this. They talk to their significant others who have passed on because it makes them feel as though they're still there, which I can understand that. All right, so the catalyst in this book is the murder of an influencer named Andrew Fairbanks. So he was killed on a yacht after modeling for a brand called Crusher Energy Drinks. He was hung upside down and then fed to the sharks. People were hoping that he was dead before the sharks ate him because, there was also a bag of money found on the boat, right? The thing is, though, there were 2 other murders very similar to Andrew's not too long ago, and all 3 of them were clients of Maximum Impact. That is not good PR for your company, right? Even worse, Amy seems to have been in the vicinity of each of these crimes. Did she kill them? If you're wondering, no, she didn't. But she's sure going to have to try and find out who did, because while she's still guarding Rosie, her colleague, an ex-Navy SEAL, suddenly points a gun at her and tells her that he was paid a lot of money to either kill her or kidnap her, and Amy wasn't sure which one. But thank goodness she's saved by Rosie and an Oscar trophy. Not Rosie's, she won it in a poker game. And the 2 of them escape the island. So Rosie is only too happy to be leaving the island. She was getting bored anyway. And they escape in Rosie's boat, which leaks. But Rosie figures that it's fast enough that by the time it's actually ready to sink, they will have reached the mainland. Ever the optimist, our dear Rosie. So Rosie's motto in life is, if you see a door, walk through it. It's not always the best plan, but it probably makes for a pretty exciting life, though. So Rosie and Amy head to the mainland to visit a man named Sheriff Justin Scroggy, who was at the Andrew Fairbanks crime scene and could probably, tell them a thing or two. So the 2 of them sneak onto the mainland towards Scroggy's house. Well, Amy sneaks. Rosie saunters across to the house wearing a rhinestone jumpsuit and a tiara, because you should always dress for the occasion. Amy is being very quiet. But then she throws a stone through Scroggy's window when she realizes that no one is at home. She should really learn to pick a lock. So Rosie finds the most useful piece of evidence in the house, though, Scroggy's laptop. Just after, she finds something else. So Amy asks her, "Where was it?" Amy asks Rosie from the hallway. "In here," says Rosie from a den off the hallway. Amy heads through the door to see Rosie proudly pointing at a computer. "Good work," says Amy. "Thanks," says Rosie, then cocks her thumb over her shoulder. "I spotted it right after I saw his dead body." Amy's eyes followed Rosie's thumb to the other side of the den, where the body of Sheriff Justin Scroggy is hanging by his bound hands from a ceiling joist. Amy looks back at Rosie. "I'm a writer," says Rosie. "I notice things." That made me laugh, right? Do you see why I love Rosie? So anyway, someone then starts shooting at them, and the 2 of them scupper and they manage to lose him. So luckily, they managed to actually get some very good information off Scroggy's computer, specifically that he was the one who actually killed poor Andrew Fairbanks, right? But he's not the mastermind behind the situation. So Amy figures, though, that they need to keep moving, and she tells Rosie that they need to find a place to stay low for a while. She also needs to find someone who could perhaps help her with the situation, because she's a bodyguard, she's not a detective, right? And who does she think of? But Steve, her father-in-law, who's actually solved a murder or 2 in his days. So Rosie sends over her private plane to bring him to the States. And Steve is not a man who likes to travel. Okay. So Steve, in the meantime, has been having like a bit of an adventure of his own. Amy's boss, a man called Jeff Nolan, took on a client who's a money launderer. And the idea was that his officers would protect the people who were smuggling the money. So like clearly Jeff wasn't too scrupulous about his clientele. However, when 2 of Jeff's clients were actually caught smuggling large amounts of money, he told this client of his, Francois Loubet, not his real name, that he needs to stop doing this because it tarnishes the reputation of his business. Then Mr. Loubet started killing his smugglers. He's pretty smart, like he was using low-level influencers who were trying to like build themselves up by offering them fake advertising opportunities, flying them out to wherever they needed to be with a bag containing like a large amount of money, and they were not aware that there was money in the bag. And then he had them killed. So Andrew Fairbanks was one of these unfortunates. Him and the previous 2 victims were all clients assigned to Amy, but they were all low priority clients, so they don't have full-time security detail with them, right? They just get like periodic check-ins. So anyway, they were recruited through a company called Vivid Viral Media, a digital marketing company run by a 70-something-year-old woman, which in itself is like pretty suspicious, right? And she's like supposedly this one-woman operation, and like she has no idea about digital marketing. And there's also someone named Joe Blow involved, but Jeff doesn't know who that is. But he suspects that it might be his ex-business partner, Hank. And so Jeff contacts Steve to tell him that he thinks Amy is in danger. But before he can actually tell Steve anything of value, he's kidnapped and presumed dead. But with Jeff, as Amy says, if there is no body, he is definitely not dead. So Steve has also picked up on the issue of vivid viral media, situated in another small village close to his own, which he finds a very strange location for such a high-profile company. In fact, all of the brands that they represent, Crusher Energy Drinks being one of them, have these rudimentary websites, and Andrew Fairbanks only had 14,000 followers on Instagram, which to Steve hardly seemed like a lot for such a supposedly famous fitness influencer. So Steve is pretty smart, eh? But he doesn't want to get involved because, he's done with all that. He enjoys his quiet, routine life. And, the pub quiz is on a Wednesday, so he has to be done with everything by then. Then he gets a call from Amy, who asks him to come to the States to help her and Rosie solve the murders before she gets convicted of all three. And he very reluctantly agrees. The roaming charges are apparently really expensive. They have different shows on TV in America. And it's Saturday already, so he's hoping that they'll solve the murders in time for the Wednesday night pub quiz. So, so that's part one of the story, really, right? Francois Loubet is determined to kill Amy because he feels that she is a loose end. So while he is sure that she would be framed for the murders anyway, he feels more comfortable killing her and then having her posthumously convicted. It's just I think it feels better to him that way. The problem is that Amy is proving difficult to kill. He has his murder broker. Everyone should have a murder broker. Rob Kenna on it, but Rob is really messing up. So Rob sends one of his old friends to follow Amy and Rosie out to St. Lucia, the scene of the first victim's murder, but he gets thrown off their trail and gets sent to Hawaii instead by this lovely US Customs and Border Control officer who bonded with Steve over Van Halen and cats. So the issue of vivid viral media in Letchworth has been troubling Steve, right? So he sends one of his friends named Tony Taylor down to do a little bit of spying, which resulted in the cutest chapter ever, which I'm going to share with you, right? So the chapters are relatively short, but bear with me. So this guy, Tony Taylor, he's a mechanic. He goes down to vivid viral media where he meets the lady who is running the situation. And she's in her 70s, right? And he's also an older person. So let's go. Chapter 48. She asks him, "May I make you a cup of tea, Mr. Taylor?" "Only if you're having one," says Tony Taylor. "I don't want to impose." "Couldn't harm, could it, after your journey?" The journey had been a pleasant surprise, if Tony Taylor is honest. The A31 turned out to be clear as a bell. Couldn't believe his luck there. M27, no major problems. The traffic backed up around Junction 2 of the M3, but when doesn't it? The usual fun and games on the M25, but then clear from Junction 9 all the way to Letchworth Garden City. So all in all, Tony couldn't complain. Should have taken 2 hours and 23 minutes. Actually took 2 hours and 15 minutes. Tony had been tempted to say no to the whole plan, but Steve was a good mate. So, against his better judgment, he decided that just this one time he would risk the traffic. "Couldn't harm at all," says Tony. "Nice cuppa." He gave back the time he'd saved, however, because parking was prohibitive in the centre of Letchworth Garden City. £2.40 an hour, he'd said to the attendant. "Who do you think I am, Rockefeller?" And so he had parked on a residential street 8 minutes away from Felicity Wollaston's office. So it was swings and roundabouts. "A nice cuppa," agrees Felicity. "She must be, 70-odd? Good nick, great hair. I'm guessing you'd like PG tips?" "Then you're guessing right," says Tony. "Give that woman a goldfish." Felicity laughs as she fills the kettle. Apropos of absolutely nothing, Tony thinks she has a delightful laugh. "Thanks for seeing me on such short notice," says Tony. "I'm not really in show business, so I have no idea how it all works." "What are you in, Mr. Taylor?" Felicity asks as she uncouples a pair of tea bags. "Cars," says Tony. "And call me Tony. Only the taxman calls me Mr. Taylor." Felicity laughs again. "Taxman indeed. Are you sure you're not in comedy? You're a hoot." Tony knows he's a funny guy, but people often tell him that he's not. It is refreshing to see his banter making an impact, and on a professional. Steve had called him yesterday, outlined what he needed. "Just a bit of info, Tony. Tell a few white lies." "Like a spy?" Tony had asked, and Steve had said, "Well, no, not really. Just a friendly chat. See what you can see." And Tony had said, "That sounds a lot like a spy to me." And Steve had said, "Look, mate, would it make you happier if I said you were a spy?" And Tony said, "Me? No skin off my nose. I'm just saying, call it what it is." And Steve had said, "Okay, you're a spy." And Tony had sucked his teeth and given it some thought and said, "Okay, I'll do it. For you, mate, I'll spy." Then they talked about the weather in St. Lucia for a bit. Too hot. But Tony could have told him that, and how Amy was. She's very well. And what Rosie D'Antonio was like. Very much her own woman, apparently. So what brings you to Letchworth Garden City, Tony? Felicity asks. My nephew, says Tony. He's an influencer, you see. I see, says Felicity, filling their mugs. In what area? Southampton, says Tony. No, what's his area, his specialty? Who does he influence? Tony knew he should have thought his story through more on the journey up, but spies have to think quick. Spies, says Tony. The word was in his head, and now it is on the table. Spies, says Felicity. Goodness me, how does one influence spies? Instagram, says Tony. He had done some thinking. And what does he do on Instagram? Tony hadn't expected the third degree. He takes a sip of his tea. It is much too hot, but it gives him vital thinking time. Gadgets, secret bugs, and spy guns. Is that tea not too hot? Asks Felicity. No, it's perfect, says Tony. So what does a viral media company do? Gracious, says Felicity. I mean, what don't we do? Yeah, says Tony. It's like people ask what I do all day. Clutches, brake pedals, dings, used to do MOTs but lost my license. Exactly, says Felicity. Clutches, brake pedals, etc. Etc., agrees Tony. But if my nephew... What's your nephew's name, Tony? Again, he could have prepped this. He's called Tony. Tony like you, says Felicity. I approve. Keep it in the family. And what would he like to do? He read about influencers doing adverts, says Tony. This bit he's remembered. How does that all work? How does it work, muses Felicity. How does it work? That's the million-dollar question. Literally, I hope, says Tony, and there's that laugh again. But seriously, as the expert, how does it work? Well, says Felicity, as the expert, lots of ways, really. She's being quite secretive, avoiding the questions. Tony will report this back. But what like, says Tony, so a company has got like a drink or a hi-fi or a Walkman and they come to you and you give them an influencer. Pretty much, says Felicity. You've hit the nail on the head there, Tony. And what would he get paid, says Tony. I mean, says Felicity, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, you know? Tony nods. He does know. Something he won't share with Steve is how much he likes what he sees. How easy it seems to be to talk to Felicity Williston. Spies mustn't fall in love, though. It's the first rule. Do you have any of his work I could look at? Felicity asks. Are her eyes blue or grey? Whose work, sorry, says Tony. Remain focused, fella. Look sharp. Tony's work, says Felicity. Tony's spy work? Didn't bring any with me, I'm afraid, says Tony. But we can look online, says Felicity. If you have it, says Tony. Felicity laughs again. So Tony didn't even know he was being funny this time. Felicity just seems to bring it out in him. You have a very nice smile, Tony, says Felicity. It would really work on camera. That's a professional opinion. Thank you, says Tony. Thank you. You have a very nice dress. Thank you. And face. Felicity smiles again. Tony wants to invite her to the pub, have a bit of lunch, talk about something else. But he knows he can't. He hasn't got a single piece of information out of her that he can pass on to Steve. The only information he has gleaned so far is that there's a picture of a man on her desk, but she's not wearing a wedding ring. Nope, he has to stay here and ask more questions about her agency. Be professional, Tony. What would James Bond do? I was wondering if you'd like to go to the pub, says Tony. Get a spot of lunch. That is actually, I think, very James Bond of him, though. He sees Felicity freeze for a moment. Of course, he's been an idiot. Tony realizes she was just laughing to be polite. She said he had a nice smile to be polite. She's got a lovely guy waiting for her at home with the big dog and all his hair. Sorry, says Tony. Of course not. You must be very busy. Stupid of me to ask. Felicity thinks for a moment more, then leans forward. Tony, can I tell you a secret? You're not hungry? Guesses Tony. Well, that wouldn't be a secret, silly, says Felicity. Tony, I feel like I can trust you. You can, says Tony. Everybody can. Felicity looks around her, trying to form her thoughts into words. I'm not busy, you see. I'm never busy. I don't really do anything. Okay, says Tony. I don't really know what I do anymore or what my company does. And I've been thinking lately that it would be very nice to talk to someone about it. I see, says Tony. And then in you walk, says Felicity, with your lovely smile and your big hands. She doesn't do anything, doesn't actually know what her business is. Tony is dimly aware that Steve will want to know this, but for the moment he's too busy looking at his own hands. Shall we? Says Felicity, standing. There's a posh pub, or there's the Crown, where you can get a shepherd's pie. Shepherd's pie for me, says Tony. Shepherd's pie is perfect, says Felicity. Absolutely perfect. Tony Taylor smiles. It is a reminder that sometimes in life, you really should risk the traffic. It was such a cute chapter because neither of them has a clue what they are talking about. But they fumble through this conversation somehow, and they even end up making a date. Like, how sweet is that, right? But you could tell, like, from that conversation that he actually finds out quite a fair bit to tell Steve. So Rob Kenner, the murder broker, has managed to get hold of an old contact on St. Lucia, a man named Nelson Nunes, who's a politician there, by the way. And he tells him to let him know if two women, one of whom is the author, Rosie D'Antonio, arrive on the island. Or he says two people, right? So Nelson volunteers to take care of Amy for him, and Rob agrees. Yeesh. So they're heading to Nelson's place anyway, Steve, Amy, and Rosie, right, to find out about the death of the first influencer, and when they get there, they're ambushed. The problem is that Nelson was told there were two people, but now there's three people, so he's not sure who he's supposed to kill. So after some hilarity, he figures out that he's supposed to kill Amy, but Steve pulls a Superman and he gets them out of the situation. I mean, wow, he was just epic. He even gets some information from Nelson about who he's been communicating with. Like, it was brilliant. So the other guy who's been in pursuit of Amy, named Eddie Flood, is also on his way to St. Lucia. He's the backup plan in case Nelson fails. So Eddie is Rob's old friend. So when he gets there, he asks this taxi driver named Ferdy if he's seen Rosie D'Antonio arrive with someone. Shame Ferdy tries to head him off, but Eddie is like smarter this time. He knows that they're following the murder trail and that the last influencer was killed in Cork, Ireland, so that they would now be heading off to Dublin, which is exactly where he goes. I swear clever hitmen are the worst, hey? So Amy narrowly escapes him at the airport, and then they come up with a plan. Well, like, actually Rosie does, and it's brilliant. She books herself onto an Irish breakfast show, and she spins a story of how she was saved by drowning by none other than Mr. Eddie Flood, and he's refused to take a reward from her. So if anyone sees him, to please call her immediately so that she may reward him. And so they splash his picture all over the screen, and then to top it off, she also offers a reward to the person who is able to lead her to him. So naturally, like, Eddie finds himself bombarded by people taking his picture, and he can't even move anywhere. So obviously he can't do anything, right? But he's not too broken up about this, though. In fact, like, he didn't even want to shoot Amy. He could see her perfectly well through the car window. It wasn't tinted. He missed on purpose because he needed her to stay alive so that he could complete the rest of his plan. Intrigue. So Tony contacts Steve, right, to find out what he learned from Felicity at Vivid Viral Media. And he asks him specifically about a fourth victim who was imprisoned in Dubai for money smuggling and was killed just as they were trying to make contact with her. But Felicity says that she's never heard of her, even though she's supposed to have been her client. And this pushes Steve to voice a hunch he has about who a major accomplice to the murder might be, to the murderer. It's not really a popular opinion amongst the others, but I could see where he was coming from with the idea. And then this takes us neatly to part 3, right? So Steve and Rosie are now on another private plane, and Steve finds himself thinking that it's not as luxurious as the others he's been on. Then he's like, what's happening to me? He's disappointed that there's no private chef, though, because, like, he really wanted a sandwich. And he acknowledges that air travel has, like, officially been ruined for him forever. He will never be able to fly economy now. So they're hunting down Steve's suspect, which is why they're flying to Dubai to the Diamond Conference, hey? And who does Rosie happen to meet there but her would-be Russian assassin, Vasily Karpin. It turns out he's quite lovely, really, and he doesn't want to kill her because his sister-in-law wants a signed copy of her book, and she threatened to kill him if he kills Rosie, and apparently his sister-in-law is not someone that you want to mess with. So after signing the book, Rosie is like a bit confused because she knows that she saw Eddie Flood skulking around their hotel. What does he want if not to kill her? You'll have to read the book to find out. I'm not going to tell you. So meanwhile, Amy is back in London at Maximum Impact Security Office to investigate the identity of the murderer, right? And she has, incidentally, like, she's been set up as the scapegoat, right, by the murderer, and she's now being pursued by the authorities. This is what happens when the police arrive at their safe house. There is a knock at the door. Everyone looks at each other, then at Steve. One by one, Amy, Jeff, and Hank stand, pull guns, and point them towards the hallway of the house. Amy then pulls a second gun from her thigh and throws it to Steve. Blimey, says Tony. Amy is in a crouch, gun in hand. Hank is secreted behind an IKEA multimedia unit, gun up to his eye, and Jeff is standing, bold as brass, in the middle of the room, gun arm extended. Rosie is draped on the sofa, enjoying the show. It's just perfect, right? Like, I love Rosie. I love her. And this book is filled with scenes like this, right? It's that British humor that I love. And so you can see that Jeff is there, because remember Amy said that in the case of Jeff, if there's nobody, he's not dead. So Amy, Jeff, and Susan, who's the head of HR, are all there, like, trying to work it out, right? And suddenly, like, guns are pulled and Jeff is shot. Like, what? But it's the sweet Steve who figures out who the murderer actually is. And he approaches him, like, calm as, like, a sleeping kitten, hey? And he confronts him about what he has done. I'm not going to tell you who the murderer is, because, I mean, like, this book is a murder mystery, and I feel like if I tell you who the murderer is, then it's a little bit much. But obviously, like, they solve the murder, right? And Amy and Steve decide that they've had such a good time solving this murder that they figure they'd like to do it again. And with Rosie as an investor backing them up, they have all the startup capital they need and more, because she outbid herself, right? And guess what they decide to call their agency? That's right. We Solve Murders. So I've given you, like, the basic outline again of this book. But, like, you can see there are storylines that I haven't gone into because, yeah, look, it's not a very long book. So I just feel like I don't want to give you everything, because then, you know, it's like, why should you read it? But you should read it anyway, just because it's so well written. So Amy, Steve, and Rosie will definitely be back with some more murder mystery shenanigans, and I will definitely be along for the ride. So Osman writes such amazing characters. Amy's like this little stick of dynamite, and she's hiding her tragic past, right? Because she hints at it, like, quite a bit. That, like, she knows how to deal with fear and dangerous situations. But we don't, like, really hear more about it. And Steve is, like, obviously still feeling the loss of his wife. And I don't think that that's something you ever get over. It's rather something that you learn to live with. And that's obviously, right, why he talks to her, because it makes him feel like she's still around. But I also, like, really admire the way Steve's dealt with it, because the narrative goes like this. Steve has learned that you must never resent other people for their happiness. Everyone is taking the best shot they've got, and some shots are just luckier than yours. Anytime you feel your unhappiness turning into bitterness, you have to check yourself. You can live with unhappiness, but bitterness will kill you. And I could really appreciate that from him, because I think that if you're miserable, it's so easy to like, you know, hate other people for their happiness, and, like, because now you're going through this, and how dare somebody else be happy. And I really respect him for that. You know, it's that you should never resent others for their happiness, even if you're going through a hard time. So Steve, on top of this, also struggles to bond with his son. His son is Amy's husband, yeah. And they haven't actually had a proper conversation since he was young. And then again, Rosie is just perfection. Steve says that she isn't irresistible to people because she's famous. She's famous because she's irresistible to people. And I agree with him completely. She's wonderful. Though she does seem to struggle with loneliness, and she seems to have a fear of becoming attached to people. So it goes like this. It's funny, across a lifetime, the people you pick up, it's often the most unexpected ones who stick around. There are friendships forged in fire which end up disappearing like smoke, and other casual, nodding friendships which will stay with you for the rest of your life. So this was Rosie's perspective. It changes often throughout the book. But this was interesting to me. I'm not too sure, honestly, if she means that the nodding relationships are the people you become closer to over time, or if those are the ones that are just, like, present in your life for longer. I'm not sure. What do you think? She says that everyone dies, and if they're not yet dead, they will eventually die, which is, like, pretty bleak. But Steve picks up on this, and he offers her his friendship, which is really lovely. So you can see, like, why I love these characters so much. I'd rate them like Rosie, Steve, and then Amy. I don't know, maybe I'll grow more attached to Amy in, like, the subsequent books. The only thing that was a little odd for me is that we don't see much of Amy's husband, Adam. And, like, they live apart because they have very different jobs, and obviously Amy's work as a bodyguard like takes her here and there to look after her clients. So they don't really live together, and you get the impression also that they don't see each other very often. And Steve doesn't love this. He tells Amy that it's really silly that they don't live together because you don't have all the time in the world, and he knows what he's talking about. Yeah. But again, we have more story ahead of us, so I'm sure Adam will eventually make an appearance. The fact that this is a book of the story is about a father-in-law and a daughter-in-law is a very interesting combination, yeah? And they're so close. So like after Steve shoots a guy, he says, it's not every daughter-in-law who will high-five you when you've shot a drug dealer in a Coldplay t-shirt, is it? So he also says that the Coldplay t-shirt made it easier to shoot the guy, though. Like, how sweet is that, right? But it's that I think that they have some shared trauma, right, with Amy's past and Steve's loss. So they seem to bond over not needing to talk about their issues. Because I think like Amy only really started calling Steve every day after his wife passed away. And I think also obviously that Amy's a bodyguard and Steve was a cop. So that's something that also bonds them. Some like shared love for violence, like especially Amy. Jeez, man, just wants to shoot people and punch people. But I feel like that's actually Richard Osman for you, right? Thursday Murder Club was all about people over the age of 70 years, septuagenarians, which is not something that you come across often. So I think that he likes to explore these like these kind of unique dynamics. And if you like dry British humor, this book is for you. Cozy mystery, this book is for you. Light-hearted read, this book is for you. It's rated 4.1 stars on Goodreads, but I gave it a solid 5 because I just enjoyed it so much. And if this sounds like something you'd like to read, you can pick up a copy at any bookstore, really. It's very popular at the moment. And if you've already read this one, let me know what you think. I'm on Instagram at Raz the Reader and TikTok at Books and Mortar. I also have this really lovely email address that goes like this, booksandmortar2024 at gmail.com. It's booksandmortar2024 at gmail.com. You can also leave a comment on whatever podcast streaming platform you use. You can find Books and Mortar on iono.fm. It's a South African podcasting platform. It's also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Audible, YouTube, and I even have a website that is booksandmortar.buzzsprout.com where you can find all of my episodes. That's booksandmortar.buzzsprout.com. Buzzsprout is buzz, B-U-Z-Z, sprout, S-P-R-O-U-T, like a plant sprouting. I'd love to hear from you, so like please hit me up. Until next time, this is the Books and Mortar podcast with me, your host, Rizia, where we talk about the books that build us. Bye.